Chapter 11 of the Black Moth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tara Mendoza. The Black Moth by Georgette Heyer. Chapter 11. My lord turns rescuer and comes nigh ending his life. Late that afternoon Carstares left Thurze House on one of his friend's horses. He waved a very regretful farewell to O'Hara and his lady, promising to let them know his whereabouts and to visit them again soon. O'Hara had extracted a solemn promise that if ever he got into difficulties he would let him know. "For I'm not letting ye drift gaily out of me life again, and that's flat." Jack had assented gladly enough. To have a friend once more was such bliss, and had given Miles the name of the inn and the village where he would find him, for O'Hara had insisted on bringing the mare over himself. So Carstares rode off to Trencham and to Jim, with the memory of a very hearty handshake in his mind. He smiled a little as he thought of his friend's words when he had shown himself reluctant to give the required promise. "Ye obstinate young deevil! Ye'll do as I say and no nonsense, or ye don't leave this house." For 6 years no one had ordered him to obey. It had been he who had done all the ordering. Somehow it was very pleasant to be told what to do, especially by Miles. He turned down a lane and wondered what Jim was thinking. That he was waiting at the Green Man, he was certain, for those had been his orders. He was annoyed with the man over the incident of the pistols, for he had inspected them and discovered that they were indeed unloaded. Had his captor been other than O'Hara, on whom he could not fire, such carelessness might have proved his undoing. Apart from that, culpable negligence always roused his wrath. A rather warm 20 minutes was in store for Salter. For quite an hour Carstares proceeded on his way with no mishaps nor adventures, and then suddenly, as he rounded a corner of a deserted road, little more than a cart track, an extraordinary sight met his eyes. In the middle of the road stood a coach, and by it, covering the men on the box with 2 large pistols, was a seedy-looking ruffian, while 2 others were engaged in what appeared to be a life-and-death struggle at the coach door. Jack reined in his horse and rose in his stirrups to obtain a better view. Then his eyes flashed and he whistled softly to himself, for the cause of all the turmoil was a slight, graceful girl of not more than 19 or 20. She was frenziedly resisting the efforts of her captors to drag her to another coach, further up the road. Jack could see that she was dark and very lovely. Another elderly lady was most valiantly impeding operations by clawing and striking at one of the men's arms, scolding and imploring all in one breath. Jack's gaze went from her to a still silent figure at the side of the road in the shadow of the hedge, evidently the stage manager. "It seems I must take a hand in this," he told himself, and laughed joyously as he fixed on his mask and dismounted. He tethered his mount to a young sapling, took a pistol from its holster, and ran softly and swiftly under the lee of the hedge up to the scene of disaster, just as the man who covered the unruly and vociferous pair on the box made ready to fire. Jack's bullet took him neatly in the neck, and without a sound he crumpled up, one of his pistols exploding harmlessly as it fell to earth. With an oath the silent onlooker wheeled round to face the point of my lord's gleaming blade. Carstares drew in his breath sharply in surprise as he saw the white face of his Grace of Andover. "Damn you!" said Tracy calmly, and sprang back, whipping out his own rapier. "Certainly," agreed Jack pleasantly. "On garde, M. Ledoux." Tracy's lips curled back in a snarl. His eyes were almost shut. Over his shoulder he ordered curtly, "Keep watch over the girl. I will attend to this young jackanapes." On the word the blades clashed. Jack's eyes danced with the sheer joy of battle, and his point snicked in and out wickedly. He knew Tracy of old for an expert swordsman, and he began wearily. The girl's persecutors retained a firm hold on either arm, but all their thoughts were centred on the duel. The men on the box got out their blunderbuss, ready to fire should the need arise, and the girl herself watched breathlessly, red lips parted and eyes aglow with fright, indignation and excitement. As for the old lady, she positively bobbed up and down, shrieking encouragement to Carstares. The blades hissed continuously against one another, for time after time the Duke thrust viciously, and ever his point was skilfully parried. He was absolutely calm, and his lips sneered. Who it was that he was fighting he had not the faintest idea. He only knew that his opponent had recognised him and must be speedily silenced. Therefore he fought with deadly grimness and purpose. Carstares, on the other hand, had no intention of killing his Grace. He had never liked him in the old days, but he was far too good-natured to contemplate any serious bloodshed. He was so used to Tracy's little affairs that he had not been filled with surprise when he discovered who the silent figure was. He did not like interfering with Belmanoir, but on the other hand he could no more stand by and see a woman assaulted than he could fly. So he fought on with the idea of disarming his Grace, so as to have him at a disadvantage, and to be able to command his withdrawal from the scene. Once he feinted cleverly and lunged, and a little blood trickled down over the Duke's hand. No sign made Belmanoir, except that his eyelids flickered a moment and his play became more careful. Once the Duke thrust in fierce, and Jack's sword-arm wavered an instant, and a splash of crimson appeared on his sleeve. He, for the most part, remained on the defensive, waiting for the Duke to tire. Soon his Grace's breath began to come unevenly and fast, and beads of moisture started on his forehead. Yet never did the sneer fade, nor his temper go. He had himself well in hand, and although his face was livid and his brain on fire with fury, no trace of it showed itself in his sword-play. Then Carstares changed his tactics, and began to put into practice all the arts and subtleties of fence that he had learned abroad. He seemed made of steel and set on wire, so agile and untirable was he. Time after time he leapt nimbly aside, evading some wicked thrust, and all the while he was driving his Grace back and back. He was not panting, and now and again he laughed softly and happily. The blood from the wound on his arm was dripping steadily onto the ground, yet it seemed to Tracy to affect him not at all. But Jack himself knew that he was losing strength rapidly, and must make an end. Suddenly he fainted and fell back. Tracy saw his advantage and pressed forward within the wavering sword point. The next instant his sword was whirled from his grasp, and he lay on the ground, unhurt but helpless, gazing up at the masked face and at the shortened rapier. How he had been thrown he did not know, but that his opponent was a past master in the art of fence he was perfectly sure. My lord gave a little chuckle and twisted a handkerchief about his wounded arm. "I am aware, monsieur, that this is most unusual, and in duels forbidden. But I am sure that my lord will agree that these circumstances are also most unusual, and the odds almost overwhelming." He turned his head to the two men of one whom released his hold on the girl's arm and started forward. "Oh, no," drawled my lord, shaking his head. "Another step, and I spit your master where he lies." "Stand," said his Grace calmly. "Bien. Throw your arms down, here at my feet, and release mademoiselle." They made no move to obey, and my lord shrugged deprecatingly, lowering his point to Tracy's throat. "Eh bien?" They still hesitated, casting anxious glances at their master. "Obey," ordered the Duke. Each man threw down a pistol, eyeing Jack furtively, while the girl ran to her aunt, who began to soothe and fuss over her. Jack stifled a yawn. "It is not my intention to remain here all night. Neither am I a child or a fool. Dépêchez." Belmanoir saw that the coachman had his blunderbuss ready and was only too eager to fire it, and he knew that the game was up. He turned his head towards the reluctant bullies, who looked to him for orders. "Throw down everything," he advised. 2 more pistols and 2 daggers joined their comrades. "1,000 thanks," bowed my lord, running a quick eye over the men. "Emily Duke, I pray be still. Now you, with the large nose. Yes, mon ami, you. Go pick up the pistol our defunct friend dropped." The man indicated slouched over to the dead body and flung another pistol onto the heap. My lord shook his head impatiently. "Mais non, have I not said that I am not entirely a fool? The unexploded pistol, please." You will place it here, doucement? Very good." His eye travelled to the men on the box. The coachman touched his hat and cried, "I'm ready, sir." "It is very well. Be so good as to keep these gentlemen covered, but do not fire until I give the order. And now, le Duc, have I your parole that you will return swiftly from whence you came, leaving this lady unmolested, and I permit you to rise?" Tracy moved his head impatiently. "I have no choice." "Monsieur, that is not an answer. Have I your parole?" "Yes, curse you." "But certainly," said Jack politely. "Pray, rise." He rested his sword point on the ground and watched Tracy struggle to his feet. For an instant the Duke stood staring at him with face slightly outthrust. "I almost think I know you," he said softly, caressingly. Jack's French accent became a shade more pronounced. "It is possible. I at least have the misfortune to know monsieur by sight." Tracy ignored the insult and continued very, very silkily. "One thing is certain. I shall know you again if I meet you." Even as the words left his mouth, Jack saw the pistol in his hand and sprang quickly to one side, just in time to escape a shot that would have gone straight through his head. As it was, it caught him in his left shoulder. "Do not fire!" he called sharply to the coachman and bowed to his Grace. "As I was saying, monsieur, do not let me detain you, I beg." The Duke's green eyes flashed venom for a minute, and then the heavy lids descended over them again, and he returned the bow exaggeratedly. "Au revoir, monsieur." He smiled and bent to pick up his sword. "It will not be necessary for monsieur to take his sword," said Jack. "I have a desire to keep it as a souvenir, yes?" "As you will, monsieur," replied Tracy carelessly, and walked away to his coach, his men following close on his heels. My lord stood leaning heavily on his sword, watching them go, and not until the coach had swung out of sight did he give way to the weakness that was overwhelming him. Then he reeled and would have fallen had it not been for two cool hands that caught his, steadying him. A tremulous, husky voice sounded in his ears. "You are hurt? Ah, sir, you are hurt for my sake!" With a great effort Jack controlled the inclination to swoon, and lifted the girl's hand shakily to his lips. "It is a pleasure, mademoiselle," he managed to gasp. Diana slipped an arm under his shoulder and cast an anxious glance at the footman hurrying towards them. "Quick!" she commanded. "Sir, you are faint. You must allow my servant to assist you to the coach." Jack forced a smile. "It is nothing, I assure you. Pray do not, and he fainted comfortably away into stout Thomas's arms. "Carry him into the coach, Thomas," ordered the girl. "Mind his arm, and oh, his poor shoulder! And have you something to bind his wounds with?" Miss Betty hurried forward. "My darling child, what an escape! The dear, brave gentleman! Do have a care, Thomas. Yes, lay him on the seat." My lord was lowered gently on to the cushions, and Miss Betty fluttered over to him like a distracted hen. Then Diana told Thomas to take charge of my lord's horse that they could see, quietly nibbling the grass further down the road, stooped and picked up his Grace of Andover's sword with its curiously wrought hilt, and jumped into the coach to help Miss Betty to attend to Jack's wounds. The slash on the arm was not serious, but where the pistol had taken him was very ugly looking. While she saw to that, Miss Betty loosened the cravat and removed my lord's mask. "Di, see what a handsome boy 'tis! The poor brave gentleman! What a lucky thing he came up! If only this bleeding would stop!" So she ran on, hunting wildly for her salts. Diana looked up as her aunt finished, and studied the pale face lying against the dark cushions. She noted the firm, beautifully curved mouth, the aristocratic nose and delicately pencilled eyebrows with a little thrill. The duel had set her every nerve tingling. She was filled with admiration for her preserver, and the sight of his sensitive, handsome countenance did nothing to dispel that admiration. She held the salts to his nostrils and watched eagerly for some sign of life, but none was forthcoming, and she had to be content with placing cushions beneath his injured shoulder and guarding him as best she might from the jolts caused by the uneven surface of the road. Miss Betty bustled about and did all she could to staunch the bleeding, and when they had comfortably settled my lord, she sat down upon the seat opposite and nodded decisively. "We can do no more, my dear. But yes, certainly bathe his forehead with your lavender water. Dear me, what an escape! I must say I would never have thought it of Mr. Everard. One would say we were living in the Stone Age. The wretch!" Diana shuddered. "I knew he was dreadful, but never knew how dreadful. How can he have found out when we were to leave Bath? And why did he waylay us so near home? Oh, I shall never be safe again!" "Nonsense, my dear! Fiddlesticks! You saw how easily he was vanquished. Depend upon it, he will realise that he has made a bad mistake to try to abduct you, and we shall not be worried with him again." With this comfortable assurance, she nodded again and leant back against the cushions, watching her niece's ministrations with a professional and slightly amused air. End of Chapter 11. Recording by Tara Mendoza. Phoenix, Arizona, August 2011. Of the Black Moth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tara Mendoza. The Black Moth by Georgette Heyer. Chapter 12. My lord dictates a letter and receives a visitor. My lord came sighing back to life. He opened his eyes wearily and turned his head. A faint feeling of surprise stole over him. He was in a room he had never been in before, and by the window, busy with some needlework, sat a little old lady who was somehow vaguely familiar. "Who are you?" he asked, and was annoyed to find his voice so weak. The little lady jumped and came across to him. "Praise be to God!" she ejaculated. "Likewise bless the boy. The fever is past." She laid a thin hand on his brow and smiled down into his wondering eyes. "As cool as a cucumber, dear boy. What a mercy!" It was a long time since anyone had called Jack dear or boy. He returned the smile feebly and closed his eyes. "I do not understand anything," he murmured drowsily. "Never trouble your head then. Just go to sleep." He considered this gravely for a moment. It seemed sensible enough, and he was so very, very tired. He shut his eyes with a little sigh. When he awoke again, it was morning of the next day, and the sun streamed in the window, making him blink. Someone rustled forward, and he saw it was the lady who had called him dear and bidden him go to sleep. He smiled, and a very thin hand came out of the bedclothes. "But who are you?" he demanded a little querulously. Miss Betty patted his hand gently. "Still worrying your poor head over that? I am Di's Aunt Betty, though, to be sure, you don't know who Di is." Remembrance was coming back to my lord. Why, you are the lady in the coach. Tracy, I remember." "Well, I know naught of Tracy, but I'm the lady in the coach." "And the other?" "That was Diana Beaulieu, my niece, the pet. You will see her when you are better." But where am I, madame?" "Now, don't get excited, dear boy." "I'm 30, protested Jack with a wicked twinkle. "I should not have thought it, but 30's a boy to me in any case," retorted Miss Betty, making him laugh. "You are in Mr. Beaulieu's house, Di's father, and my brother, and here you will stay until you are quite recovered." Jack raised himself on his elbow, grimacing at the pain the movement caused him. "Egad, madame, have I been here long?" he demanded. Very firmly was he pushed back on to his pillows. "Will you be still? A nice thing 'twould be if you were to aggravate that wound of yours. You will have been here a week to-morrow. Bless my heart, what ails the boy?" for Jack's face took on an expression of incredulous horror. "A week, madam? Never say so." "'Tis as true as I stand here. And a nice fright you have given us, what with nearly dying and raving about your Dicks and Jims." My lord glanced up sharply. "Oh, so I talked?" "Talk? Well, yes, if you can call all that mixture of foreign jargon talking. Now you must be still and wait till the doctor comes again." For a while Carstares lay in silence. He thought of Jim and smiled a little. "I could not have thought of a better punishment had I tried," he told himself, and then frowned. "Poor fellow, he'll be off his head with fright over me. Betty?" "Well, and aren't you not asleep yet?" "Asleep, madam? Certainly not," he said with dignity. "I must write a letter." "'Deed, and you shall not." "But I must. 'Tis monstrous important, madam." She shook her head resolutely. "Not until Mr. Jameson gives permission," she said firmly. Jack struggled up, biting his lip. "Then I shall get up," he threatened. In an instant she was by his side. "No, no! Lie down now and be good." "I will not lie down and be good." "Then I shan't let you touch a pen for weeks." Jack became very masterful and frowned direfully upon her. "Madam, I insist on being allowed to write that letter." "Sir, I insist on your lying down." He controlled a twitching lip. "Woe betide you unless you bring me pen and paper, Miss Betty." "But, dear boy, reflect, you could not use your arm." "I will use it," replied Jack indomitably. But he sank back onto the pillows with his eyes closed and a tiny furrow of pain between his straight brows. "I told you so!" scolded Miss Betty, not without a note of triumph in her voice, and proceeded to rearrange the disorderly coverlet. The blue eyes opened wide, pleadingly. "Madam, indeed 'tis very important." She could not withstand that look. "Well," she compromised, "I'll not let you write yourself, that's certain. But could you not dictate to me?" Jack brightened and caught her hand to his lips. "Miss Betty, you are an angel," he told her. "Ah, now get along with you." She hurried away to fetch paper and ink. When she turned, she found him plucking impatiently at the sheet and frowning. "I am ready," she said. "Thank you, madam. 'Tis very kind in you." "Nonsense!" He laughed weakly. "I want you to write to my servant, to bid him bring my baggage to the nearest inn." "That will I not. I shall tell him to bring it here." "But, Miss Betty, I cannot possibly trespass upon—" "Will you have done? Trespass indeed!" "I perceive I shall be much put upon," sighed Jack, and watched her lightning smile. "You, boy, will you dictate?" "Very well, ma'am. No, I have changed my mind. I'll have it writ to a friend, please. Dear Miles." "True to my promise." "I write to you?" "In case—" "You should be worried—" "Over my disappearance. Be it known that I am at— Pray, madam, where am I?" "Horton Manor, Littledean," she replied, writing it down. "Thank you. I had the misfortune to injure my shoulder in a—" "An arm," put in the scribe inexorably. "And arm. In a fight, and a certain very kind lady—" "I refuse to write that rubbish. One of the ladies whom I rescued—" "Good heavens, madam, you've not put that?" cried Jack, horrified. She smiled reassuringly. "I have not. I put, 'My nurse is writing this for me.'" "Madam, you are of a teasing disposition," reproved Jack. Yes. When you take Jenny over to Trencham, will you please tell Jim to bring my baggage here at once? Have you that, Miss Betty?" Yes. Remember me to Lady Molly, I beg, and accept my apologies and thanks." He paused. "Will you sign it J.C., please, and address it to Sir Miles O'Hara, Thurze House, Maltby?" "Sir Miles O'Hara is your friend? Mr. I do not know your name." "Carr," began Jack, and stopped, biting his lips. "Carr," he continued imperturbably. "John Carr. Do you know O'Hara, Miss Betty?" "Me? No. Will he come to see you, do you think?" "If you let him in, madam." "Gracious! Well, I'll tell Thomas to ride over with this at once." "Miss Betty, you are marvellously good. I vow I can never thank—" "Bless the boy! And what about yourself, pray? I shudder to think of what might have happened to Di if you had not come up. 'Tis we can never thank you enough." Jack reddened boyishly and uncomfortably. "Indeed, you exaggerate." "Tut, tut! Well, go to sleep, and never worry about anything till I return. And you won't try and get up?" He shook with laughter. "I swear I will not. Even an you never return, I will lie here wasting away." But he spoke to space, for with a delighted laugh she had left the room. It was not until late that afternoon that O'Hara arrived, and he was conducted, after a brief conversation with Diana and her father, to my lord's room, where Miss Betty received him with her cheery smile and jerky curtsy. "You'll not excite Mr. Carr," she said, but was interrupted by my lord's voice from within, weak but very gay. "Come in, Miles, and never listen to Miss Betty. She is a tyrant and denies me my wig." O'Hara laughed in answer to Miss Betty's quizzical smile, and strode over to the bed. He gripped my lord's thin hand and frowned down at him with an assumption of anger. "Young good-for-naught! Could ye find naught better to do than smash yourself up and well-nigh drive your man crazy with fright?" "Oh, pshaw! Did you find Jim?" O'Hara looked round and saw that Miss Betty had discreetly vanished. He sat gingerly down on the edge of the bed. "Ay, I took the mare over as soon as I had your letter, and a fine scare you gave me, Jack. I can tell you, she recognised him, and I accosted him." "I'll swear you did not get much satisfaction from Jim," said my lord. "Did he look very foolish?" "To tell you the truth, I thought the man was half daft, and wondered whether I'd been after making a mistake. But in the end I got him to believe what I was trying to tell him, and he has taken the mare and will bring your baggage along this evening. By the way, Jack, I told him of our little meeting and of your pistols being unloaded. He said 'twas his fault and you never saw aught to touch his face. Put out was not the word for it." "I suppose so. Look here, Miles, this is a damned funny affair. What happened to you exactly?" "'Tis what I am about to tell you. After I had left you, I rode on quite quietly for about an hour, and then came upon Miss Beauleigh's coach, stopped by 3 blackguards who were trying to drag her to another coach belonging to the gentleman who conducted the affair. So of course I dismounted and went to see what was to be done." "You would, be after poking your nose into what didn't concern ye. 4 men, and ye had the audacity to tackle them all. 'Tis mad ye are entirely." "Of course, if you had been in my place you would have ridden off in another direction or aided the scoundrels," was the scathing reply. O'Hara chuckled. "Well, go on, Jack. I'm not saying I don't wish I had been with ye." "'Twould have been superb. I suppose Miss Beauleigh has told you most of the tale, but there is one thing that she could not have told you, for she did not know it. The man I fought with was Belmanoir." "Thunder and turf! Not the Duke?" "Yes, Tracy." "Zounds! Did he know ye?" "I cannot be certain. I was masked, of course, but he said he thought he did. 'Twas at that moment he fired his pistol at me." "The dirty scoundrel!" Yes. 'Tis that which makes me think he did not know me. Damn it all, Miles, even Tracy would not do a thing like that." "Would he not? If you ask me, I say that Tracy is game enough for any kind of devilry." "But My dear fellow, that is too black. He could not try to kill in cold blood a man he had hunted with and fenced with, and no man could." O'Hara looked extremely sceptical. "Because ye could not yourself is not to say that a miserable spalpeen like Belmanoir could not." "I don't believe it of him. We were always quite friendly. If it had been Robert, now— But I am not going to believe it. And don't say anything to these people, O'Hara, because they do not know Devil. I gather from what Miss Betty says that he calls himself Everard. He met the girl, Diana, at Bath. You know his way. She'd none of him, hence the abduction." "Heavens! But 'tis a foul mind the man's got." "Where women are concerned, yes. Otherwise 'tis not such a bad fellow, Miles." "I've no use for that kind of dirt myself, Jack." "Oh, I don't know. I daresay we are none of us exactly saints." He changed the subject abruptly. "How is Jenny?" "Rather off her feed, missing you, I expect. I left her with your man. He should be arriving soon, I should think. I don't fancy he'll waste much time." "Neither do I. Poor fellow! He must have worried terribly over this worthless master." "Sure, his face was as white as your own when I told him you were wounded." Carstares turned his head quickly. "What's this about my face? Just be so kind as to hand me that mirror, Miles." O'Hara laughed and obeyed, watching my lord's close scrutiny of his countenance with some surprise. "Interesting pallor, my dear friend, interesting pallor. Nevertheless, I am glad that Jim is on his way." He met O'Hara's eyes as he looked up, and his lips quivered irrepressibly. "You think me vain, Miles?" "It is a pose of yours, John. Is it Sir Anthony Ferndale Bart?" "No, I believe it is myself. You see, when one has but oneself to live for and think of, one makes the most of oneself, hence my vanity. Take the mirror away, please. The sight of my countenance offends me." "Sure, ye are free with your orders, me lord," said O'Hara, putting the glass down on the table. "And while I think of it, what might your name be now?" "John Carr. A slip of the tongue on my part, stopped in time. I hear my mentor returning. And Miles—" "Well?" "Come again." "Come again? My dear boy, you'll be sick of the sight of me soon. I'll be here every day." "Thanks. It will take a good deal to sicken me, I think." He bit his lip, turning his head away as Miss Betty came into the room. "I'm afraid you ought to leave my patient now, Sir Miles," she said. "He has had enough excitement for one day, and should sleep." She glanced at the averted head inquiringly. "I doubt he is tired?" Jack turned and smiled at her. "No, Miss Betty, I'm not. But I know you will refuse to believe me." "My dear boy, do you know you have black lines beneath your eyes?" "More remarks about my face," he sighed, and glanced at O'Hara, who had risen. "Ye are quite right, Miss Beauleigh. I must go. May I come again tomorrow?" "Surely," she beamed. "We shall be delighted to welcome you." O'Hara bent over the bed. "Then au revoir, Jack. My lady sent her love to her cousin Harry, the saucy puss." "Did she? How prodigious kind of her, Miles. And you'll give her mine, and kiss her?" "Yes," said O'Hara with dangerous calm. "I'll kiss her what?" "Her hand for me," ended Carstares, bubbling over. "Goodbye, and thank you." "That will suffice," said Miles, cutting him short. He bowed to Miss Betty and left the room. The businesslike little lady fluttered over to the bedside and rearranged the pillows. "Well, and are you satisfied?" "Most extraordinarily so, I thank you. I shall be getting up soon." Was all she vouchsafed, and left him to his meditations. As she had foreseen, he dozed a little, but his shoulder would not allow him to sleep. He lay in a semi-comatose condition, his eyes shut, and a deep furrow telling of pain between his brows. The sound of a shutting door made him open his eyes. He turned his head slightly and saw that Jim Salter was standing in the middle of the room, looking at him anxiously. My lord returned his gaze crossly, and Jim waited for the storm to break. Carstares' heart melted, and he managed to smile. "I'm monstrous glad to see you, Jim," he said. You can't mean that, sir?" 'Twas I left your pistols unloaded." "I know. Damned careless of you. But it's the sort of thing I should do myself, after all." Jim advanced to the bedside. "Do you mean you forgive me, sir?" "Why, of course. I could not have fired on my best friend in any case." "No, sir, but that don't make it any better." "It doesn't, of course, and I was rather annoyed at the time. Oh, devil take you, Jim, don't look at me like that. I'm not dead yet." If you had been killed, sir, 'twould have been my fault." "Rubbish! I'd a sword, hadn't I? For heaven's sake, don't worry about it any more. Have you brought all my luggage?" "Yes, sir. It shan't occur again, sir." "Certainly not. Jenny is well?" "Splendid, sir. Will you still trust me with your pistols, sir?" Carstares groaned. "Will you have done? 'Twas an accident and I have forgotten it. Here's my hand on it." He grasped Jim as he spoke, and seemed to brush the whole subject aside. "Have you disposed of that horrible coat you tried to make me wear the other day?" "I gave it to the landlord, sir." "I should have burned it, but perhaps he liked it." "He did, sir. Will you try to go to sleep now?" "If you had a shoulder on fire and aching as mine does, you wouldn't ask such a ridiculous question," answered Jack snappishly. "I'm sorry, sir. Is there aught I can do?" "You can change the bandages if you like. These are prodigious hot and uncomfortable." Without another word, Salter set about easing his master, and he was so painstaking and so careful not to hurt the ugly wound, and his face expressed so much concern, that Carstares controlled a desire to swear when he happened to touch a particularly tender spot, and at the end rewarded him with a smile and a sigh of content. "Ah, that is much better," he said. "You have such a light touch, Jim." The man's face reddened with pleasure, but he said nothing, and walked away to the window to draw the curtains. End of Chapter 12. Recorded by Tara Mendoza, Phoenix, Arizona, August 2011. Chapter 13 of The Black Moth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tara Mendoza. The Black Moth by Georgette Heyer. Chapter 13. My Lord Makes His Bow. After Jim's arrival, my lord recovered quickly, each day making great progress, much to the doctor's satisfaction, who never tired of telling Mr. Beauleigh and Miss Betty that it was entirely owing to his treatment that the patient had recovered at all. As his idea of treatment mainly consisted of copiously bleeding John, which process Miss Betty very soon put an end to, he and she had many arguments on the subject, in which he was completely routed. She held that Mr. Carr was well on the strength of her own nursing and his own constitution, and very probably she was right. In any case, hardly a fortnight after O'Hara's first visit, my lord was standing before his mirror, surveying himself, with his head speculatively on one side and a worried look in his eyes. Salter watched him anxiously, knowing this to be a critical moment. His master was somewhat of an enigma to him. The important things in life never appeared to affect him, but over a question of 2 cravats as opposed to each other, or some equally trivial matter, he would become quite harassed. After contemplating his appearance for several moments, Carstares frowned and looked over his shoulder. "I have changed my mind, Jim. I will wear blue after all." Salter sighed despairingly. "You look very well in what you have on, sir," he grunted. Jack sat down obstinately. "I have conceived a dislike, nay, a veritable hatred for puce. I will wear blue." "Now, sir, do have done changing your clothes. You'll be tired out before ever you get downstairs, and you know what the doctor said." My lord consigned the doctor and his words of wisdom to a place of great heat. "Ay, sir, but—" "The doctor is a worthy individual, Jim, but he knows even less of the art of dressing than you do. He does not understand the soul agony of a man who makes his first appearance in puce. But the blue coat laced with gold, sir, I order it. I insist. the blue coat or not." "Very well, sir." Resignedly Jim walked to the cupboard. When at length his lordship was dressed to his entire satisfaction, it was midway through the hot June afternoon, and Miss Betty was tapping at the door, wishing to know whether Mr. Carr was coming down, or whether he was not. Carstares shifted his sling, and taking up his hat, moved just a little shakily to the door. Salter opened it and cast a triumphant glance at Miss Betty, as though he were showing off all my lord's graces. He proffered an arm. "Shall I help ye, sir?" Miss Betty curtsied low. "La, Mr. Carr!" John bowed profoundly. "Give ye good den, madam," he said. "I am just about to descend. Thank you, Jim." He leaned heavily on the man's arm. Miss Betty walked around him admiringly. "Lud, 'tis mighty elegant, I vow, but I protest I am shy." "Egad, Miss Betty, and why?" "You are not so young as I imagined," she replied candidly. "Bear in mind, madam, that I never sought to deceive you. I am an aged man. 30, she scoffed and went on. "Come, child, and mind the first step." At the bottom of the staircase stood Mr. Beauleigh, a man of medium height, thin-lipped and grey-eyed. He came forward with one hand outstretched. "I am delighted to see you so much better, sir. I trust your shoulder no longer pains you?" My lord pushed Jim gently to one side and placed his hand in Mr. Beauleigh's. "I thank you, sir. It is almost well. But for Miss Betty, who, I fear, has the makings of a true tyrant, I should not wear this obnoxious sling." Mr. Beauleigh smiled a little. "Ah, yes, she keeps us all in order, does Betty. Pray, will you not walk a little in the garden? There are chairs on the lawn, and here is my daughter." He waved to the door, and Carstares, turning, beheld Diana. She stood framed by the dark wood, gowned in amber silk, with old lace falling from her elbows and over the bosom of her dress. Her hair was dark as night, with little tendrils curling over her broad white brow. One rolling curl fell over her shoulder, the rest were gathered up under a small lace cap, which was secured by means of a riband passed beneath her chin. Jack gazed and gazed again, and in her turn Diana studied him with wide brown eyes of almost childlike innocence. Then her lids fluttered and curling lashes veiled the glorious depths, as the slow blush mounted to her cheeks. My lord recovered his manners and made his most approved leg as her father presented him. "My love, this is Mr. Carr." Diana sank into a curtsy. "And Mr. Carr, this is my daughter, Diana." "I am delighted to make Miss Beauleigh's acquaintance," said John, and raised her hand to his lips. The delicate, tapering fingers trembled a little in his hold, and tremulous lips parted in the shyest and most adorable smile that he had ever seen. "Indeed, sir, we are already acquainted. I am not like to forget my rescuer." "I am happy to think that I was able to be of some service to you, mademoiselle. Believe me, it was an honour to fight in your cause." His eyes were on the fascinating dimple that played about her mouth. "'Tis very kind of you to say so, sir. I fear we greatly incommoded you, and—" She made a gesture towards his sling. "That, mademoiselle, is less than nothing. All the obligation is on my side." Miss Betty bustled forward. "Now that will do. I never heard such a foolish set of compliments. You are looking tired, Mr. Carr. Come into the garden and rest." Salter stepped forward, but Diana stayed him with uplifted finger. "If Mr. Carr will accept my arm," she hazarded. Jack flushed. "Indeed, no, Miss Beauleigh, I can—" "Oh, tut, tut!" cried Miss Betty. "Have done dilly-dallying. Take him out, Di." Mr. Beauleigh had already disappeared. His world lay in his library, and he was never far from it for any length of time. Now he had seized the moment when his sister was not looking to withdraw quietly, and when she turned round she was only in time to see the library door close softly. "Your papa has gone again," she remarked to her niece. "What a trying man he is, to be sure." She followed the pair out onto the lawn, and helped to make Carstares seat himself in a long chair under a great elm. A cushion was placed under his wounded shoulder and another at his back. "And are you sure that you are quite comfortable?" inquired Miss Betty anxiously, bending over him. Jack laughed up at her.
"Quite sure, thank you, madame. But where will you sit?" "I shall sit in this chair, and Di will sit on a cushion," throwing one down, "at my feet, just so." "I see that you are ruled with a rod of iron, mademoiselle," he said, and watched the dimple tremble into being. "Indeed, yes, sir. 'Tis very sad." Miss Betty chuckled and unrolled a packet of silks which she threw into her niece's lap. "Will you have the goodness to sort those for me, love?" she asked, taking out her embroidery. "Pray allow me to assist," pleaded John. Diana rose and planted her cushion down beside his chair. She then knelt down upon it and emptied the multicoloured strands on to his knee. "Very well. You must be very careful to separate the different pinks, though. See, we will have the rose here, the salmon here, the deeper rose here, the pale pink over there, and the reds. There is no more room. We will put the reds in this paper." "Certainly," agreed Carstares. "Are we to leave the other colours until the pinks are sorted?" She nodded and bent her head over the silks. "Is Sir Miles coming this afternoon, Mr. Carr?" "Why, yes, Miss Betty. Now you mention it, I remember that he is. Miss Beauleigh, I defy you to put that one on the rose pile. 'Tis a shade too deep." "I am sure 'tis not. Where is one to compare with it?" Carstares produced a long thread and held it next to hers. The two heads were bent close over it. Diana sighed. "You are right. I can just see the difference, but 'tis very slight." Miss Betty peeped over their shoulders. "Gracious, what an eye you must have! I can detect no difference." Her eye ran along the row of silks laid out on my lord's white satin leg. "Mr. Carr," said Diana suddenly, "I want to ask you something that has been puzzling me." "Faith, what is it, Miss Beauleigh?" "Just this. Why did you call Mr. Everard M. le Duc?" There was a tiny pause. My lord looked down into the gold-flecked eyes and frowned a little. "Did I call him that?" "Yes, I remember it distinctly. Was it just a manner of speaking?" "Just a manner of speaking. You may call it that, mademoiselle. Do you not think that he rather looks ducal?" "I tried not to think of him at all. I hate him." "Almost I begin to pity Mr. Everard," quoth Jack. The dimple peeped out. "Then 'tis most ungallant of you, sir," she reproved. "Do you know Mr. Everard?" "I have certainly seen him before, madame." Diana sat back on her heels and eyed him wonderingly. "I believe you do not wish to answer me," she said slowly. "Tell me, is Everard that man's real name?" My lord twisted the ring on his finger uneasily. He did not feel himself at liberty to expose Belmanoir, and if he should reveal his true identity, it was quite possible that Mr. Beauleigh might seek him out, in which case he himself might be recognised. He looked up. "Pardon me, mademoiselle, but whence this cross-examination?" Diana nodded placidly. "I thought you would refuse. But I have discovered something that will confound you, sir." She rose to her feet. "I will go and get it." She walked gracefully away towards the house, and my lord watched her go. "Now I am going to ask a question," broke in Miss Betty's voice. He threw out an imploring hand. "Madame, I beg you will consider my feeble condition. Am I fit to bear the strain, think you?" "I do. Is it usual for gentlemen to ride masked as you were?" At that he laughed. "No, madame, but for the gentlemen of the high toby, it is de règle." She paused with her needle held in mid-air. "Now what mean you by that?" "Just that I am a common highwayman, Miss Betty." She stared at him for a moment and then resumed her work. "You look it." John cast a startled glance down his slim person. "Is that so, madame? And I rather flattered myself I did not." "I was only laughing at you. You do not expect me to believe that fabrication, surely?" "I fear I do," he sighed. "'Tis very true, alack." "Oh, indeed? Also a friend of Sir Miles O'Hara, J.P., and of Mr. Everard?" "At least the last named is not an acquaintance to be proud of," he retorted. Perhaps not. My Di says he is some great gentleman. I perceive that your Di is by nature suspicious. Why does she think that? You will see. Di, love, here is Mr. Carr trying to make me believe that he is a highwayman." Diana came up to them smiling.
"I fear he teases you, aunt. Do you remember this, sir?" Into Jack's hands she put his Grace of Andover's sword. Carstares took it, surprised, and glanced casually at the hilt. Then he started up. "Why, 'tis his sword, and I thought 'twas left on the roadside. Can it be— Did you bring it, mademoiselle?" She dropped him a curtsy and laughed. "You are surprised, sir? You demanded the sword, so I naturally supposed that you required it. Therefore I brought it home." "'Twas monstrous thoughtful of you, then. I dared not hope that it had not been forgotten." "I am very grateful."
"Then pray show your gratitude by sitting down again," advised the elder Miss Beauleigh. "Remember that this is your first day up, and have a care."
John subsided obediently, turning the sword over in his hands. Diana pointed to the wrought gold hilt with an accusing finger. "An I mistake not, sir, that is a coronet." My lord's eyes followed the pink-tipped finger and rested wrathfully upon the arms of Andover. It was like Tracy to flaunt them on his sword hilt, he reflected. "It certainly has that appearance," he admitted cautiously. "Also, those are not paste, but real diamonds, and that is a ruby." "I do not dispute it, madame," he answered meekly. "And I believe that that big stone is an emerald?"
"I am very much afraid that it is."
"An expensive toy," she said, and looked sharply at him.
"Ornate, I agree, but as true a piece of steel as ever I saw," replied my lord blandly, balancing the rapier on one finger.
"A very expensive toy,"
she repeated sternly. John sighed. "True, madame, true." Then with a brightened air, "Perhaps Mr. Everard has expensive tastes?"
"It is very possible, and I think that Mr. Everard must have been more than a simple country gentleman to indulge those tastes."
Carstares bit his lip to hide a smile at the thought of Tracy in the light of a simple country gentleman, and shook his head sadly. "Do you infer that he came by this sword dishonestly, madame?"
The dimple quivered and was gone. "Sir, I believe that you are playing with me," she said with great dignity.
"Madame, I am abashed."
"I am very glad to hear it, then. I infer that Mr. Everard was something more than he pretended to be."
"In truth, a sorry rogue to deceive a lady."
"And I want to know if I am right. Is he, perhaps, some grand gentleman?"
"I can assure you, madame, that there is very little of the gentleman about Mr. Everard."
Miss Betty began to laugh.
"Have done, my dear. 'Tis of no avail, and 'tis impolite to press Mr. Carr too hard."
Diana pouted. "He is monstrous provoking, I think," she said, and eyed him reproachfully.
"I am desolated," mourned Jack, but his eyes danced.
"And now you are laughing! But then, mademoiselle, so are you." She shook her head, resolutely repressing the dimple. "Then I am inconsolable." The brown eyes sparkled, and her lips parted in spite of her efforts to keep them in a stern line. "Oh, but you are ridiculous!" she cried, and sprang to her feet. "And here is Sir Miles." O'Hara came across the lawn towards them, bowed to the ladies, and glanced inquiringly from one to the other. "Is it a joke you have?" he asked. Diana answered him. "Indeed no, sir. 'Tis Mr. Carr who is provoking." "Provoking, is it? And what has he been doing?"
"I'll tell you the whole truth, Miles," interposed the maligned one. "'Tis Mistress Diana who is so inquisitive."
"Oh!" Diana blushed furiously. "I protest you are unkind, sir."
"Sure, 'tis no gentleman he is at all."
"'Twas on the subject of gentlemen that we—"
"Quarrelled," supplied her aunt.
"Disagreed," amended his lordship. "Disagreed," nodded Diana. "I asked him whether Mr. Everard was not some grand gentleman, and he evaded the point."
"I vow 'tis slander!" cried Jack. "I merely said that Everard was no gentleman at all."
"There!
And was that not evading the point, Sir Miles?" "Was it? Sure, I'm inclined to agree with him." "I declare you are both in league against me!" she cried, with greater truth than she knew. "I mean, was he perhaps a titled gentleman?" "But how should Jack know that?" "Because I'm sure he knows him, or at least of him." "Listen, Mistress Di," broke in my lord, shooting a warning glance at O'Hara. "I will tell you all about Mr. Everard, and I hope you will be satisfied with my tale." He paused and seemed to cudgel his brain. "First, he is, of course, titled. Let me see. Yes, he is a duke. Oh, he is certainly a duke, and I am not sure but what he is royal." "Now you are ridiculous!" cried Miss Betty. "You are very teasing," said Diana, and tried to frown. "First you pretend to know nothing about Mr. Everard, and then you tell me foolish stories about him. A duke, indeed! I believe you really do know nothing about him." As Carstares had hoped, she refused to believe the truth. "He is playing with you, child," said O'Hara, who had listened to Jack's tale with a face of wonder. "I warrant he knows no Everard, eh, Jack?" "No, I cannot say that I do," laughed his lordship. But you said—" "Never mind what he said, Miss Di. 'Tis a scurvy fellow he is." She regarded him gravely. "Indeed, I almost think so." But the dimple peeped out for all that. The next instant it was gone, and Diana turned a face of gloom to her aunt, pouting her red lips adorably, so thought my lord. "Mr. Bettison," she said in accents of despair. At these mystic words Jack saw Miss Betty frown and heard her impatient remark, "Drat the man!" He looked towards the house and perceived a short, rather stout young man to be walking with a peculiar strutting gait towards them. The boy was good-looking, Carstares acknowledged to himself, but his eyes were set too close, and he did not like his style. No, certainly he did not like his style, nor the proprietary way in which he kissed Diana's hand. "How agreeable it is to see you again, Mr. Bettison," said Miss Betty with much affability. "I declare 'tis an age since we set eyes on you." "Oh no, aunt," contradicted Diana sweetly. "Why, it was only a very short while ago that Mr. Bettison was here, surely." She withdrew the hand that the young man seemed inclined to hold fast to, and turned to John. "I think you do not know Mr. Bettison, Mr. Carr," she said. "Mr. Bettison, allow me to present you to Mr. Carr. Sir Miles, I think you know." The squire bowed with a great deal of stiff hostility. Carstares returned the bow. "You will excuse my not rising, I beg," he smiled. "As you perceive, I have had an accident." Light dawned on Bettison. This was the man who had rescued Diana. Confound his impudence!
"Ah, yes, sir. Your arm, was it not? My faith, I should be proud of such a wound."
It seemed to Carstares that he smiled at Diana in a damned familiar fashion. Devil take his impudence! "It was indeed a great honour, sir. Mistress Di, I have finished sorting your green silks." Diana sank down on the cushion again and shook some more strands out onto his knee. "How quick you have been! Now we will do the blue ones." Bettison glared. This fellow seemed prodigious intimate with Diana, devil take him. He sat down beside Miss Betty and addressed my lord patronisingly.
"Let me see, Mr. Carr. I met you in town, I wonder? At Tom's, perhaps?"
This country bumpkin would belong to Tom's, reflected John savagely, for no reason at all. Aloud he said, "I think it extremely unlikely, sir. I have been abroad some years."
"Oh, indeed, sir? The grand tour, I suppose?"
Mr. Bettison's tone was not the tone of one who supposes any such thing. John smiled. "Not this time," he said. "That was 7 years ago." Mr. Bettison had heard rumours of this fellow who, it was murmured, was naught but a common highwayman.
"Really? After Cambridge, perhaps?"
"Oxford," corrected Carstares gently. "Curse his audacity!" thought Mr. Bettison.
7 years ago. Let me think. George must have been on the tour then. Selwyn, I mean.
Miss Beauleigh. Jack, who had made the tour with several other young bucks fresh down from college, accompanied as far as Paris by the famous wit himself, held his peace. Mr. Bettison then launched forth into anecdotes of his own tour, and seeing that his friend was entirely engrossed with Miss Diana and her silks, O'Hara felt it incumbent on him to draw the enemy's fire, and taking his own departure to bear the squire off with him, for which he received a grateful smile from my lord, and a kiss blown from the tips of her fingers from Mistress Di, with whom he was on the best of terms. End of Chapter 13. Recording by Tara Mendoza, Phoenix, Arizona, August 2011.
Of the Black Moth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tara Mendoza. The Black Moth by Georgette Heyer. Chapter 14. Mistress Diana is unmaidenly. The idyllic summer days passed quickly by, and every time that my lord spoke of leaving, the outcry was so indignant and so firm that he hastily subsided and told himself he would stay just another few days. His shoulder, having mended up to a certain point, refused quite to heal, and exertion brought the pain back very swiftly. So his time was for the most part spent with Mistress Di out of doors, helping her with her gardening and her chickens. For Diana was an enthusiastic poultry farmer on a small scale, and ministering to her various pets. If Fido had a splinter in his paw, it was to Mr. Carr that he was taken. If Nellie, the spaniel, caught a live rabbit, Mr. Carr would assuredly know what to do for it, and the same with all the other animals. The young pair grew closer and closer together, while Miss Betty and O'Hara watched from afar, the former filled with pride of her darling and satisfaction, and the latter with apprehension. O'Hara knew that his friend was falling unconsciously in love, and he feared the time when John should realise it. He confided these fears to his wife, who, with young David, was staying at her mother's house in Kensington. In a long and very Irish letter, she replied that he must try and coax my lord into coming to stay with them, when her charms would at once eclipse Mistress Diana's, though, to be sure, she could not understand why Miles should not wish him to fall in love, for as well he knew 'twas a prodigious pleasant sensation. If he did not know it, then he was indeed most disagreeable. And had he ever heard of anything so wonderful? David had drawn a picture of a horse. Yes, really, it was a horse. Was he not a clever child? Further, would her dearest Miles please come and fetch her home, for although mamma was prodigious amiable and wanted her to stay several weeks, she positively could not live without her husband an instant longer than was necessary. As soon as O'Hara read the last part of the letter, he brushed Carstares and his love affairs to one side, and posted straight to London to obey the welcome summons. Bit by bit my lord discovered that he was very much in love with Diana. At first his heart gave a great bound, and then seemed to stop with a sickening thud. He remembered that he could not ask her to marry him, disgraced as he was, and he immediately faced the situation, realising that he must go away at once. His first move was to Mr. Beauleigh to tell him of his decision. On being asked why he must so suddenly leave Horton House, he explained that he loved Diana, and could not in honour speak of love to her, at which Mr. Beauleigh gasped and demanded to know the reason. Carstares told him that he was by profession a highwayman, and watched him bridle angrily. Before so agreeable and so smiling, Mr. Beauleigh now became frigidly polite. He quite understood Mr. Carr's position, and yes, he honoured him for the course on which he had decided. But Mr. Beauleigh was very, very cold. Carstares gave Jim orders to pack immediately, that he might depart next day, and reluctantly informed Miss Betty of his going. She was startled and bewildered. She had imagined that he would spend all June with them. Circumstances, he regretted, willed otherwise. He should always remember her great kindness to him, and hoped that she would forgive the brusque nature of his departure. When he told Diana, her eyes opened very wide, and she laughed, pointing an accusing finger at him. "You are teasing Mr. Carr!" she cried, and ran into the house. That evening Miss Betty confirmed Jack's words, and seeing the hurt look in the girl's eyes, wisely held her peace. Next morning, in the pleasaunce, Diana came across my lord and went to him, gravely questioning. "You are really leaving us to-day, Mr. Carr?" "I am afraid I must, Mistress Di." "So suddenly? Then you were not teasing yesterday?" "No, mademoiselle, I was not. I fear I have tarried too long, taking advantage of your kindness." "Oh, no, no," she assured him. "Indeed you have not. Must you really go?" Looking down into her big eyes, John read the answering love in them and grew pale. It was worse to think that she cared too. If only he thought she was indifferent, parting would not seem so unbearable. "Mademoiselle, you overwhelm me. I must go." "Oh, but I am sorry. Your being here has been such a pleasure. She stopped and looked away across the flowers. "You," prompted Jack, before he could check himself. With a tiny laugh she brought her gaze back. "I am sorry you must leave us, naturally." She sat down beneath an arbour of roses and patted the place beside her invitingly, with just the same unconscious friendliness that she had always shown him. My lord stayed where he was, with one hand on a tree trunk and the other fidgeting with his quizzing glass. "Mistress Di, I think it only right that I should tell you what I have told your father, and what I told your aunt some time ago when she refused to believe me. To some extent I am here under false pretences. I am not what you think me." Diana laced and unlaced her fingers and thought that she understood. "Oh no, Mr. Carr." "I am afraid, yes, mademoiselle. I am a common felon, a highwayman." He bit the words out, not looking at her. "But I knew that," she said softly. "You knew it?" "Why, yes. I remember when you told Aunt Betty. You believed me. You see," she apologised, "I always wondered why you were masked, and yet you permitted me to stay." "How silly of you, Mr. Carr. Of course I do not care what you are. I owe so much to you." He wheeled round at that and faced her. "Madame, I can bear anything rather than gratitude. Is it only that which has made you tolerate me all this time?" Her fingers gripped one another. "Why, sir! Why, sir!" The flame died out of his eyes, and he drew himself up stiffly, speaking with a curtness that surprised her. "I crave your pardon. I should be whipped at the cart-tail for asking such an impertinent question. Forget it, I beg." Diana looked up at the stern face, half amazed, half affronted. "I do not think I quite understand you, sir." "There is naught to understand, mademoiselle," he answered with dry lips. "'Twere merely that I was a coxcomb enough to hope that you liked me a little for mine own sake." She glanced again at his averted head, and with a wistful little smile, "Oh," she murmured, "oh, and it is very dreadful to be a highwayman." She sighed. "Yes, mademoiselle." "But surely you could cease to be one?" coaxingly. He did not trust himself to answer. "I know you could. Please do." "That is not all," he forced himself to say. "There is worse." "Is there?" she asked, wide-eyed. "What else have you done, Mr. Carr?" "I once—" Heavens, how hard it was to say! "I once cheated at cards." It was out. Now she would turn from him in disgust. He shut his eyes in anticipation of her scorn. His head turned away. "Only once?" came the soft voice, filled with awed admiration. His eyes flew open. "Mademoiselle!" She drooped her head mournfully. "I'm afraid I always cheat," she confessed. "I had no idea 'twas so wicked, although auntie gets very cross and vows she will not play with me." He could not help laughing. "It is not wicked in you, child. You do not play for money." "Oh, did you?" "Yes, child." "Then that was horrid of you," she agreed. He stood silent, fighting the longing to tell her the truth. But do not look so solemn, sir," the pleading voice went on. "I am sure you must have had a very strong excuse." "None." "And now you are letting it spoil your life?" she asked reproachfully. "It does not wait for my permission," he answered bitterly. "Ah, but what a pity! Must one moment's indiscretion interfere with all else in life? That is ridiculous. You have, what is the word? Expiated, yes, that is it. Expiated it, I know.
The past can never be undone, madame."
That, of course, is true.
She nodded with the air of a sage. "But it can be forgotten." His hand flew out eagerly and dropped back to his side. It was hopeless. He could not tell her the truth and ask her to share his disgrace. He must bear it alone, and above all he must not whine. He had chosen to take Richard's blame, and he must abide by the consequences. It was not a burden to be cast off as soon as it became too heavy for him. It was for ever, for ever. He forced his mind to grasp that fact. All through his life he must be alone against the world. His name would never be cleared. He could never ask this sweet child who sat before him with such a wistful, pleading look on her lovely face to wed him. He looked down at her sombrely, telling himself that she did not really care, that it was his own foolish imagination. Now she was speaking. He listened to the liquid voice that repeated, "Could it not be forgotten?" "No, mademoiselle. It will always be there."
"To all intents and purposes, might it not be forgotten?" she persisted.
"It will always stand in the way, mademoiselle." He supposed that mechanical voice was his own. Through his brain thrummed the thought, "It is for Dick's sake. For Dick's sake. For Dick's sake you must be silent." Resolutely he pulled himself together.
"It will stand in the way of what?" asked Diana.
"I can never ask a woman to be my wife," he replied. Diana wantonly stripped a rose of its petals, letting each fragrant leaf flutter slowly to the ground.
"I do not see why you cannot, sir."
"No woman should share my disgrace."
"No?"
"No."
"You seem very certain, Mr. Carr. Pray, have you asked the lady?"
"No, madame." Carstares was as white as she was red, but he was holding himself well in hand.
"Then—"
The husky voice was very low.
"Then why don't you?"
The slim hand against the tree trunk was clenched tightly, she observed. In his pale face the blue eyes burnt dark. "Madame, because 'twere the action of
Of what, Mr. Carr?"
a cur, a scoundrel, a blackguard."
Another rose was sharing the fate of the first. "I have heard it said that some women like curs and scoundrels, even blackguards,"
remarked that provocative voice. Through her lashes its owner watched my lord's knuckles gleam white against the tree bark.
"Not the lady I love, madame." "Oh, but are you sure?"
"I am sure. She must marry a man whose honour is spotless, who is not a nameless outcast, and who lives not by dice and highway robbery." He knew that the brown eyes were glowing and sparkling with unshed tears, but he kept his own turned inexorably the other way. There was no doubting now that she cared, and that she knew that he did also. He could not leave her to think that her love had been slighted. She must not be hurt, but made to understand that he could not declare his love. But how hard it was, with her sorrowful gaze upon him and the pleading note in her voice. It was quivering now.
"Must she, sir?"
"Yes, madame."
"But supposing the lady did not care? Supposing she loved you and was willing to share your disgrace?"
The ground at her feet was strewn with crimson petals, and all around and above her roses nodded and swayed. A tiny breeze was stirring her curls and the lace of her frock, but John would not allow himself to look, lest the temptation to catch her in his arms should prove too great for him. She was ready to give herself to him, to face anything, only to be with him. In the plainest language she offered herself to him, and he had to reject her. "It is inconceivable that the lady would sacrifice herself in such a fashion, madame," he said.
"Sacrifice?"
She caught her breath.
"You call it that?"
"What else?"
I do not think that you are very wise, Mr. Carr, nor that you understand women very well."
"She might not call it by that name." "It would make no difference what she called it, madame. She would ruin her life, and that must never be."
A white rose joined its fallen brethren, pulled to pieces by fingers that trembled pitifully. "Mr. Carr, if the lady loved you, is it quite fair to her to say nothing?" There was a long silence, and then my lord lied bravely. "I hope that she will, in time, forget me," he said. Diana sat very still. No more roses were destroyed. The breeze wafted the fallen petals over her feet lightly, almost playfully. Somewhere in the hedge a bird was singing, a full-throated, sobbing plaint, and from all around came an incessant chirping and twittering. The sun sent its bright rays all over the garden, bathing it in gold and happiness, but for the two in the pleasaunce the light had gone out, and the world was very black. "I see," whispered Diana at last. "Poor lady!" "I think it was a cursed day that she saw me come into her life," he groaned. "Perhaps it was," her heart made answer. He bowed his head. "I can only hope that she will not think too hardly of me," he said very low, "and that she will find it in her heart to be sorry for me also." She rose and came up to him, her skirts brushing gently over the grass, holding out her hands imploringly. "Mr. Carr—" He would not allow himself to look into the gold-flecked eyes. He must remember Dick, his brother, Dick. In his hand he took the tips of her fingers and bowed, kissed them. Then he turned on his heel and strode swiftly away between the hedges toward the quiet woods, with a heart aflame with passion and with rebellion and impotent fury. He would go somewhere quite alone, and fight the devil that was prompting him to cry the truth aloud and to throw aside his burden for love, forgetting duty. But Diana remained standing amongst the scattered flowers, very still, very cold, with a look of hopeless longing in her eyes, and a great hurt. End of Chapter 14. Recorded by Tara Mendoza. Phoenix, Arizona, August 2011. Of the Black Moth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tara Mendoza. The Black Moth by Georgette Heyer. Chapter 15. O'Hara's mind is made up. Jim Salter folded one of my lord's waistcoats and placed it carefully in an open valise. Then he picked up a coat and spread it on the bed preparatory to folding it in such wise that no crease should afterwards mar its smoothness. All about him my lord's clothing was strewn. Mechlin ruffles and cravats adorned one chair, silk hose another. Gorgeous coats hung on their backs, shoes of every description, red-heeled and white, riding boots and slippers, stood in a row awaiting attention. Wigs perched coquettishly on handy projections, and piles of white cambric shirts peeped out from an almost finished bag. Jim laid the coat tenderly in the valise, coaxing it into decorous folds and wondering at the same time where his master was. He had been out all morning, and on his return had looked so ill that Jim had been worried and wished that they were not leaving Horton House quite so soon. A little while ago my lord had been closeted with his host. Jim supposed he must still be there. He reached out his hand for another waistcoat, but before his fingers had touched it he stopped and lifted his head, listening. Hasty, impetuous footsteps sounded on the stairs and came furiously along the corridor. The door was twisted open, and my lord stood on the threshold. Jim scanned the tired face anxiously, and noted with a sinking heart that the blue eyes were blazing and the fine lips set in a hard, uncompromising line. The slender hand gripped the door handle, twitched in a way that Jim knew full well. Evidently my lord was in an uncertain mood. "Have you finished?" rapped out Carstares. "Not quite, sir. I wish to leave this year and not next, if 'tis all the same to you." "Yes, sir. I didn't know you was in a hurry, sir." There was no reply to this. My lord advanced into the room and cast one glance at his scattered baggage and another all around him. "Where is my riding dress?" Jim shivered in his luckless shoes. "'Tis packed, sir. Do you want it?" "Of course I want it. Do you suppose that I am going to ride in what I have on?"
I rather thought ye were driving, Yana." "I am not. The scarlet suit at once, please." He flung himself down in a chair before his dressing table and picked up a nail file. Salter eyed his reflection in the glass dismally, and made no movement to obey. After a moment my lord swung round. "Well, what are you standing there for? Didn't you hear me?" "Ay, sir, I did. But your pardon, sir, but do ye think 'tis wise to ride to-day for the first time?" The file slammed down onto the table. "I am riding to Hawley this afternoon," said his master dangerously. "'Tis a matter of 15 miles or so, Yana. Hadn't you better—" "Damn you, Jim, be quiet!"
Salter gave it up.
"Very well, sir," he said, and unearthed the required dress. "I'll see the baggage goes by coach, and saddle the mare and Peter." "Not Peter. You go in the coach." "No, sir."
"What?" My lord stared at him. There had been a note of finality in the respectful tone. My lord became icy. "You forget yourself, Salter."
"I ask your pardon, sir."
"You will travel in charge of my things as usual." Jim compressed his lips and stowed a shoe away in one corner of the bag. "You understand me?"
"I understand you well enough, sir."
"Then that is settled."
"No, sir."
My lord dropped his eyeglass. "What the devil do you mean, 'no, sir'?"
"I ask your pardon, sir, and I presume, but I can't and won't let you ride alone with your wound but just healed."
There was not a hint of defiance or impertinence in the quiet voice, but it held a great determination.
"You won't, eh? Do you imagine I am a child?"
"No, sir, or unable to take care of myself. I think you are weaker than you know, sir."
"Oh, you do you?"
Jim came up to him.
"Ye'll let me ride with ye, sir? I won't trouble ye, and I can ride behind, but I can't let ye go alone. You might faint, sir."
"I can assure you I am not like to be a pleasant companion," said Carstares with a savage little laugh.
"Why, sir, I understand there's something troubling you. Will you let me come?"
My lord scowled up at him, then relented suddenly.
"As you please."
"Thank ye, sir." Salter returned to his packing, cording one bag and placing it near the door, and quickly filling another. The piles of linen grew steadily smaller until they disappeared, and he retired into a cupboard to reappear with a great armful of coats and small clothes. For a long while my lord sat silent, staring blankly before him. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, looking out. Then he turned and came back to his chair. Jim, watching him covertly, noted that the hard glitter had died out of his eyes and that he looked wearier than ever. Carstares studied his nails for a moment in silence. Presently he spoke. "Jim." "Yes, sir."
"I shall be going abroad again shortly."
If Carstares had remarked that it was a fine day, the man could not have shown less surprise.
"Shall we, sir?"
John looked across at him, smiling faintly.
"You'll come, Jim?"
"I would go anywhere with ye, sir."
"And what about the little girl at Fittering?"
Salter blushed and stammered hopelessly.
"My dear fellow, since when have I been blind? Did you think I did not know?"
"Why, sir— well, sir— yes, sir. Of course I knew. Can you leave her to come with me?"
"I couldn't leave ye to stay with her, sir."
"Are you sure? I do not want you to come against your inclinations."
"Women ain't everything, sir."
"Are they not? I think they are, a great deal," said my lord wistfully.
"I'm mighty fond of Mary, but she knows I must go with you."
"Does she? But is it quite fair to her? And I believe I am not minded to drag you cross-continent again."
"You won't leave me behind, sir? You couldn't do that? Sir, you're never thinking of going by yourself? I won't let ye."
"I am afraid I cannot spare you. But if you should change your mind, tell me. Is it a promise?"
"Aye, sir, if I should change my mind."
Salter's smile was grimly sarcastic. "I am selfish enough to hope you'll not change. I think no one else would bear with my vile temper as you do. Help me out of this coat, will you?"
"I'll never change, sir."
"And as to tempers—"
"As if I minded."
"No, you are marvellous. My breeches."
thanks." He shed his satin small-clothes and proceeded to enter into white buckskins. "Not those boots, Jim, the other pair." He leaned against the table as he spoke, drumming his fingers on a chair back. A knock fell on the door, at which he frowned and signed to Jim, who walked across and opened it slightly. "Is your master here?" inquired a well-known voice, and at the sound of it my lord's face lighted up, and Salter stood aside. "Come in, Miles." The big Irishman complied and cast a swift glance round the disordered room. He raised his eyebrows at sight of Jack's riding boots and looked inquiringly across at him. My lord pushed a chair forward with his foot. "Sit down, man. I thought you were in London." "I was. I brought Molly home yesterday, the darling, and I heard that you were leaving here this afternoon." "Ah? And as I'm not going to let you slip through me fingers again, I thought I would come and make sure of ye. Ye are a deal too slippery, Jack." "Yet I was coming to see you again, whatever happened." "Of course. You're coming now? To stay?" "Oh, no." O'Hara placed his hat and whip on the table and stretched his legs with a sigh. "Sure, 'tis stiff I am."
"Jim, I've a chaise outside for the baggage, so you may take it down as soon as you may be."
"Leave it where it is, Jim. Miles, 'tis monstrous good of you, but—"
"Keep your buts to yourself, Jack. Me mind's made up."
"And so is mine. I really cannot—"
"Me good boy, you're coming to stay with us until ye are recovered. If I have to knock ye senseless and then carry ye—"
The lightning smile flashed into Jack's eyes. "How ferocious! But pray do not be ridiculous over a mere scratch. Recovered indeed! Ye still look ill. Now, Jack, take that frown off your face. 'Tis of no avail. I am determined." The door closed softly behind Jim as Carstares shook his head. "I can't, Miles. You must see 'tis impossible." "Pooh!
No one who comes to Thur's house knows ye, or anything about ye. Ye need not see a soul, but come ye must." "But Miles—" "Jack, don't be a fool. I want ye, and so does Molly. 'Tis no trap, so ye need not look so scared."
"I'm not. Indeed, I am very grateful, but I cannot. I'm going abroad almost at once."
"What?"
"Yes, I mean it." O'Hara sat up. "So it has come. I knew it would." "What mean you?"
"You found out that you loved Mistress Di."
"Nonsense."
"And she you."
Jack looked at him.
"I'm a tactless oaf, I know, and me manners are atrocious to be for trying to break through the barriers you've put around yourself. But I tell you, Jack, it hurts to be kept at the end of a pole. I don't want to force your confidence, but for God's sake, don't be treating me as if I were a stranger."
"I beg your pardon, Miles. It's confoundedly hard to confide in anyone after 6 years of solitude." He struggled into his coat as he spoke and settled his cravat. "If you want to know the whole truth, 'tis because of Diana that I am going."
"Of course. You're in love with her."
"It rather points that way, does it not?"
"Then why the devil don't you just ask her to marry ye?"
"Why don't I ask her?
"Because I will not offer her a smirched name. Because I love her so much that—" He broke off with a shaky, furious laugh.
"How can you ask me such a question?"
"I am a desirable parti, eh?"
"Non de un homme."
"For what do you take me?"
O'Hara looked up, calmly studying the wrathful countenance.
"Chivalrous young fool," he drawled. Again the short, angry laugh. "It is so likely that I should ask her to marry me, is it not? Mademoiselle, you see in me an improvident fool. I began life by cheating at cards, and since then— oh, I shall believe it myself ere long. I seem to have told it to so many people, and I lay myself open to the impertinences of—" He checked himself, thinking of the interview downstairs with Mr. Beauleigh. "Rubbish, Jack!" "'Tis not rubbish. I have one recommendation, only one."
"Faith, have ye as much? What is it?"
My lord laughed bitterly. "I dress rather well."
"A fence better as far as I remember."
"I have no reason to. That is but another point to damn me. What woman would marry a fencing master? Oh, my God, what a mess I have made of my life!" He tried to laugh and failed miserably.
I rather fancy Mistress Di would."
"She will not be asked thus to demean herself," was the proud answer.
"My dear Jack, you forget you are the Earl of Wyncham."
"A pretty earl! No, thank you, Miles. Richard's son will be the earl, no son of mine." O'Hara brought his fist down on the table with a crash. "Damn Richard and his son!" My lord picked up a jewelled pin and, walking to the glass, proceeded to fasten it in his cravat. The other followed him with smouldering eyes.
"Retired into your cell again, eh?"
he growled. Carstares, with his head slightly on one side, considered the effect of the pin. Then he came back to his friend. "My dear Miles, the long and short of it is that I am an unreasonable grumbler. I made my bed, and I suppose I must–lie on it."
"And will you be after telling me who helped you in the making of it?"
Carstares sat down and started to pull on one boot. "I foresaw we shall be at one another's throats ere long," he prophesied cheerfully. "Did I tell you that I informed Mr. Beauleigh of my–profession today?" Miles forgot his anger in surprise.
"You never told him you were a highwayman!"
he cried. "Yes, I did. Why not?"
"Why not? Why not? God help us all! Are ye daft, man? Do ye intend to tell every other person you meet what ye are? Bedad, 'tis mad ye are entirely."
Carstares sighed. "I was afraid you would not understand."
"'Twould take a wizard to understand ye. Another chivalrous impulse, I doubt not."
No, it is just that I could not let him think me an honourable gentleman. He took it well on the whole, and is now frigidly polite." "Polite? I should hope so, the old scarecrow, after you'd saved his daughter on him too."
"And was he made ye so furious?"
Carstares laughed. "He and myself. You see, he lectured me, oh, quite kindly, on the error of my ways, and it hurt."
"'Tis as well ye are coming to me then, the way things are with ye at present."
My lord opened his mouth to speak, encountered a fiery glance and shut it again.
"Anything to say?"
inquired O'Hara with a threatening gleam in his eye. "No, sir," replied Jack meekly. "You will come, please?" O'Hara sprang up joyfully.
"Good lad! Lord, but I was afraid at one time. Put on your other boot while I go and look for that rascal of yours."
He hurried out of the room to find Jim, who, having foreseen the result of the contest, was already stowing the luggage away on the chaise. Half an hour later, his adieux made, Jim and the baggage following, my lord rode out with O'Hara on his way to Thur's house. For some time there was silence between the two men, with only a perfunctory remark or two on the fineness of the day and the freshness of the mare to break it. Carstares' mind was, as his friend well knew, dwelling on all that he had left behind him. His parting with Diana had been quite ordinary, she at least making no sign that he was anything beyond a chance acquaintance. Indeed, it had almost seemed to him that her attitude was slightly aloof, as if she had drawn a little into herself. Her hand, when he had kissed it, had been lifeless and cold, her smile sweetly remote. He knew that he had held the hand a fraction of a minute longer than was strictly in accordance with the rules on good manners, and he feared that he had clasped it in most unseemly wise, pressing it hard against his lips. He wondered whether she had remarked it. He little guessed that long after he had ridden out of sight, she continued to feel that pressure. If he could have seen her passionately kissing each finger separately for fear her lips might pass over the exact spot his had touched, his heart might have been lighter. It was true that she had retired into her shell, a little hurt at what she termed his man's blind obstinacy. She had laid her heart bare for him to read. She had offered herself to him as plainly as if she had spoken in terms less general than in the pleasaunce. She had fought desperately for her happiness, thrusting aside all thought of maiden modesty, and when she afterwards had realised what she had done, and tried to imagine what he must think of her, she had blushed dark and mentally flayed herself for her lack of proper pride and manners. Terrified that he might think her immodest, overwhelmed with sudden shyness, she had been colder in her attitude towards him than she had intended, even in her anxiety not to appear forward. But in spite of her coldness, how intensely had she hoped that he would sense her love and all that she wanted him to know. incomprehensible the ways of women. Not endowed with feminine perspicacity or intuition, how could John hope to understand her dual feelings? He only knew that he had hurt her, and that she had drawn back that she might not lay herself open to more. He could not hope to understand her when she did not fully understand herself. Reflecting on the swiftness with which love had come to them, he believed that with a like swiftness it might fade, at least from Diana's memory. He told himself that he hoped for that end, but he was honest enough to know that it was the last thing in the world he wanted. The mere thought of Diana indifferent to him, or worse, another man's bride, made him bite on his under lip and tighten his hold on the rein. O'Hara cast many a surreptitious glance at the stern young profile beside him, wondering whether his lordship would last out the tedious ride or no. He knew enough of Carstares' indomitable courage to believe that he would, but he feared that it would prove too great a strain on him in his present weakened condition. Very wisely he made no attempt to draw Carstares out of his abstraction, but continued to push on in silence, past fields knee-deep in grass, soon to be hay, with sorrel and poppies growing apace, along lanes with hedges high above their heads on either side, over hill and down dale, always in silence. Presently O'Hara fell a little to the rear that he might study his friend without palpably turning to do so. He thought he had never seen Jack's face wear such a black look. The fine brows almost met over his nose, with only two sharp furrows to separate them. The mouth was compressed, the chin a little prominent, and the eyes, staring ahead between Jenny's nervous ears, seemed to see all without absorbing anything. One hand at his hip was clenched on his riding whip, the other mechanically guided the mare. O'Hara found himself admiring the lithe grace of the man, and his upright carriage and splendid seat. Suddenly, as if aware that he was being studied, my lord half turned his head and met O'Hara's eyes. He gave a tiny shrug, and with it seemed to throw off his oppression. The frown vanished, and he smiled. "I beg your pardon, Miles. I am a surly fellow." "Mayhap your shoulder troubles you?" suggested O'Hara tactfully. No. I am barely conscious of it. I've no excuse beyond bad manners and a worse temper." From thence onward he set himself to entertain his friend, and if his laugh was sometimes rather forced, at least his wit was enough to keep O'Hara in a pleasurable state of amusement for some miles. By the time they arrived at Thurze House, Carstares was suspiciously white about the mouth, and there was once more a furrow, this time of pain, between his brows. But he was able to greet my Lady O'Hara with fitting elegance, and to pay her at least 3 neat, laughing compliments before O'Hara took him firmly by the arm and marched him to his room, there to rest and recover before the dinner hour. Shortly after, Jim arrived, highly contented with his new surroundings, and able to give a satisfactory verdict on Jenny's stalling. He had quite accepted O'Hara as a friend, after some jealous qualms, and was now well pleased that his master should be in his house instead of roaming the countryside. At 5 o'clock, as the gong rang, my lord descended the stairs resplendent in old gold and silver trimmings, determined to be as gay and light-hearted as the occasion demanded, as though there had never been a Diana to upset the whole course of a man's life. Not for nothing had he fought against the world for 6 long years. Their teaching had been to hide all feeling beneath a perpetual mask of nonchalance and wit, never for an instant to betray a hurt, and never to allow it to appear that he was anything but the most care-free of men. The training stood him in good stead now, and even O'Hara wondered to see him in such spirits after all that had passed. Lady Molly was delighted with her guest, admiring his appearance, his fine courtly manners, and falling an easy victim to his charm. O'Hara, watching them, saw with content that his capricious little wife was really attracted to my lord. It was a high honour, for she was hard to please, and many of O'Hara's acquaintances had been received, if not with actual coldness, at least not with any degree of warmth. At the end of the meal she withdrew with the warning that they were not to sit too long over their wine, and that Miles was not to fatigue his lordship. O'Hara pushed the decanter towards his friend. "I've a piece of news for ye, I daresay will interest ye," he remarked. Carstares looked at him inquiringly. "Ay, 'tis that his Grace of Andover has withdrawn his precious person to Paris." Carstares raised one eyebrow. "I suppose he would naturally wish to remain in the background after our little fracas." "Does he ever wish to be in the background?" "Oh, you'd probably know him better than I do. Does he?" "He does not. 'Tis always in the front he is, mighty prominent, damn him." My lord was faintly surprised. "Why that? Has he ever interfered with you?" "He has interfered with me best friend to some purpose." "I fear the boot was on the other leg." "Well, I know something of how he interferes with Dick." Carstares put down his glass, all attention now. "With Dick? How?" O'Hara seemed to regret having spoken. "Oh, well, I've no sympathy with him." "What has Tracy done to him?" "'Tis nothing of great moment. Merely that he and that worthless brother of his seek to squeeze him dry." "Robert?" "Andrew. I know very little of Robert." "Andrew? But he was a child." "And as rakish a young spendthrift as ye could wish for. Dick seems to pay their debts." "Devil take him! Why?" "Heaven knows. I suppose Lavinia insists. We all knew that was for the reason Tracy flung you both in her way." "Nonsense! We went of our own accord. She had but returned from school." "Exactly. And whose doing was that but Tracy's?" Carstares opened his eyes rather wide and leant both arms on the table, crooking his fingers round the stem of his wine-glass. "Do the debts amount to much?" "I can't tell ye that. 'Twas but by chance I found it out at all. The Belmanoirs were never moderate in their manner of living." "No, were any of us. Don't be so hard on them, Miles. I knew, of course, that the Belmanoir estate was mortgaged, but I did not guess to what extent." "I don't know that either, but Dick's money does not go to pay it off. 'Tis all frittered away on gambling and pretty women." My lord's brow darkened ominously. "Yes, I think I shall have a little score to settle with Tracy on that subject, some day." Miles said nothing. "How does Dick manage without touching my money?" "I don't know." O'Hara's tone implied that he cared less. "I hope he is not in debt himself," mused Carstares. "'Tis like enough he is in some muddle. I wish I might persuade him to accept the revenue." He frowned and drummed his fingers on the table. O'Hara exploded. "Sure, 'twould be like you to be doing the same. Let the man alone for the Lord's sake, and don't be after worrying your head over a miserable spalpeen that did ye more harm than—" "Miles, I cannot allow you to speak so of Dick. You do not understand." "I understand well enough. 'Tis too Christian you are entirely, and let us have an end of this farce of yours. I know that Dick cheated as well as you do, and I say 'tis unnatural for you to be wanting him to take your money after he's done you out of honour and all else." Carstares sipped his wine quietly, waiting for Miles's anger to evaporate, as it presently did, leaving him to glower balefully. Then he started to laugh. "Oh, Miles, let me go on my own road. I'm a sore trial to you, I know." Then suddenly sobering, "But I want you not to think so hardly of Dick. You know enough of him to understand a little how it all came about. You know how extravagant he was and how often in debt. Can you not pardon the impulse of a mad moment?" "That I could pardon. What I cannot forgive is his unutterable meanness in letting you bear the blame." "O'Hara, he was in love with Lavinia." "So were you." "Not so deeply. With me 'twas a boy's passion, but with him it was serious." O'Hara remained silent, his mouth unusually hard. "Put yourself in his place," pleaded Jack. "If you—" "Thank you." O'Hara laughed unpleasantly. "No, Jack, we shall not agree on this subject, and we had best leave it alone. I do not think you need worry about him, though. I believe he is not in debt." "Does he have fair luck with his racing and his—" O'Hara smiled grimly. "Dick is a very changed man, John. He does not keep racehorses, neither does he play cards, save for appearance's sake." "Dick not play? What then does he do?" "Manages your estates and conducts his wife to routs, when in town," bitterly. "He inhabits your house." "Well, there is none else to use it. But I cannot imagine Dick turned sober. 'Tis easy to be righteous after the evil is done, I'm thinking." My lord ignored this remark. A curious smile played about his mouth. "Egad, Miles, 'tis very entertaining. I, the erstwhile sober member. What is the matter?" "Am now the profligate. I dice, I gamble, I rob. Dick, the ne'er-do-weel, is saint. He lives a godly and righteous life, and is robbed by his wife's relations. After all,
I do not think I envy him overmuch."
"At least you're enjoying life more than he does," said O'Hara, grinning, "for you have no conscience to reckon with."
Carstares' face was inscrutable. He touched his lips with his napkin and smiled. "As you say, I enjoy life the more, but as to conscience, I do not think it is that." O'Hara glanced at him, sitting sideways in his chair, one arm flung over its back.
"Will you be offended if I ask you a question?"
"Of course not."
"Do you intend to go back to this high road robbery?"
"I do not."
"What then will ye do?"
The shadows vanished, and my lord laughed. "To tell you the truth, Miles, I've not yet settled that point. Fate will decide, not I."
End of Chapter 15. Recording by Tara Mendoza. Phoenix, Arizona, August 2011.